Hey, Eric. It's going to be I think this is going to be a great podcast.
I agree, John. We're going to be talking about KYA, maybe a new acronym, Know Your Agent.
Okay. Well, let's ground this. And for folks that might have be listening to us in episode 5, which we recorded back in December of last year, we talked about trust and governance. We presented a 7-layer framework. And so this is really a follow-up on really thinking about the perspective of the agent and how we think about know your agent. So why don't you teach us how to get started, Eric?
Sure. Well, let me explain, I guess, why this matters and why it matters now, I suppose. We know enterprises everywhere are entering the agent landscape. They are experimenting, and some of these things are on their way to production. But here's what we do know. There's going to be thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe millions of agents in every single enterprise. That has two implications. One is you got to figure out how you're going to manage thousands, tens of thousands of things. And then the second thing is, if these agents are working at agent speed or machine speed instead of employee speed, the blast radius, it not only can be big, but it can be frequent. So this is a particular urgent item right now.
I could not agree more. And I think there are so many topics that we can talk about as we cover know your customer and bring it around to agents. So, do you want to stack the deck and teach us how a bank thinks about that original KYC process that we're all, we're both very familiar with? And I'm happy to pile on
Well,
as
I
well.
think you have a huge amount of experience in this area, but I'll try and whet everybody's appetite.
Okay.
So KYC, or stands for Know Your Customer, and KYB, its business equivalent, Know Your Business. And the key thing they're trying to do, an organization, this is particularly important for banks, insurance companies, anybody in the financial services industry, health industry. These things are particularly important. They try and do 3 or 4 things. They're trying to manage their risk, and by confirming the identity of an individual, a customer, or a business, they're able to manage elements of that risk. They can do credit reports on them. They can verify where they live, that they're a real person. So that's kind of the first one. They want to manage the risk. The second thing is it gives them a vehicle for applying risk-based controls. So
Yeah.
if you want to have an investment account, and we know that is, you've told us that as a customer, there's certain checks and balances that need to be put in place for that versus if you're opening a simple savings account or checking account. The last one I would say is that for heavily regulated industries like banking and insurance, compliance is crucial. So the ability
Yeah.
to actually retain evidence of that, should there be a legal proceeding or otherwise, is crucial. So this is all about knowing your customer to manage risk, to apply controls, and to ensure that you have auditability and explainability and evidence.
Yeah. And it reminds me when I learned about KYC was because I'm a data guy, it was an AML or anti money laundering project. And they said, well, you got to go through this KYC process. And I'm like, huh, that's fascinating. What does that mean? And as I learned it, it was to understand, that that person has provided evidence. Here's my driver's license, my passport, or if it was a business, when I opened a business banking account, I had to provide articles of incorporation, my tax ID number, all this evidence collection so that they could gather that. And as I learned, make sure that I wasn't on a watch list, right? And so there's all kinds of lists now that are for sanctioned individuals, countries, jurisdictions, transaction types, transaction amounts. As I learned more and more, I realized that there's a whole industry around KYC and very informative, but it's not enough. And let's talk about the agent view and you can introduce a new acronym. if you want.
Sure. So we're calling it KYA, obviously a riff off of KYC or KYB. But know your agent, we think, although it's a riff off of those things, we think it is absolutely critical, and we don't mean to make light of the acronym. But
Right.
here's fundamentally what we're trying to do is just like a bank wants to know its customer.
Yeah.
An organization that runs agents wants to know their agents. They want to ensure that they have a verifiable and persistent identity for those agents. They want to be able to use that so they can monitor agent misbehavior and
Yep.
bad practices. They want to be able to use that identity also to apply controls, role-based access control, etc. And then, with that identity and all the actions that the agent may take and audit logs and such, the actions are tied to an identity, so they can actually have assurance that the agent is actually doing what it's supposed to. So KYA, we would humbly suggest, is as crucial as KYC and KYB is to regular business processes.
In order to have this conversation, let's create another acronym. Know your employee. And, this is where I was working with a bunch of risk professionals and they were teaching me, hey, did you know that first party risk and bad actors inside the bank or people that have infiltrated the bank, that's a thing too. And so I'm not sure that there's an acronym called KYE, know your employee, but it seems to me that that same risk that exists with an employee doing things exists for an agent doing the same sorts of activities that an employee might delegate to an agent. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I kind of like your acronym that you just created, the
It-
KYE, know your employee. Actually, in fact, I think it's actually a better model for KYA, for knowing your agents, than KYC is. I know we're throwing around these acronyms. Let me explain why I think that. Um,
okay.
an employee acts within the confines of a business. They can do things. They participate in business processes. They can make payments. They can take in invoices, modify accounts, access a database. So we put very strict controls around what an employee can do, because if they do something untoward, criminal behavior, they can impact the customer, it can impact the organization. So we have HR departments literally in place to know your employee. Agents are exactly the same thing. I think in one of our earliest episodes, we said that one of the ways to actually look at an agent is to model it as a person. Well, I'm going to say the best way to know an agent is to model it as an employee. So we want to be able to, just like an employee, identity and onboarding is crucial. We want to be able to ensure that the identity of the agent is managed in a consistent way, in an identity book of record, where an employee may have persistent role-based access controls. An agent may have some of those, but there's also probably some time boxed role and access controls that you may want to apply, so that if an agent requires elevated permissions, it's only for a very short period of time for it to do its thing. Training. Employees are trained so they can do the best possible job. Agents also need training.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's done differently, but they need to
Yeah.
have access to the policies and such of the organization. Last but not least, and I'm going to ask you some of what your thoughts are, but we manage employee performance. We need to
Yeah.
manage agent performance, and there's different ways to do that too.
Yeah. Okay. So, and thank you. When I think about onboarding, I have a lot of experience, as do you. I've spent the last decade or so as a freelancer after I left big consulting, and I'm always being onboarded to new systems, new customers. And so I've seen every cross section of maturity of business process and technical process around onboarding new employees or and contractors. And there's a lot of risk. When you look at how breaches have happened in the past, I'm thinking about an old one, where contractors were exposing data from systems. But this idea that the onboarding process for employees and that very complicated process that requires a lot of people in the bank to work together between the IT system, the system owner, oy vey, there is a lot that has to get done. I just think about my job because I'm a data guy. They always ask me to onboard onto their cloud platform, their email ID. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. I usually recommend they set up secure sign on and multi factor authentication into the cloud database. As you know, I did a lot of Snowflake. And so setting up SSO and multi factor authentication is now a best practice. And so ay caramba, so many different people are involved in the process. It's hard to get it right today for organizations. And I just say that out loud because I think when we think about how to explain the problem from a KYA, or then I think we're going to need to treat it as a serious thing and think about it as a first class problem that we have to solve for.
Your database background, just to illustrate the complexity behind this,
Yeah.
when you look at Snowflake and you compare it to Oracle or you compare it to Postgres or MongoDB or any of the other data, is there a level of consistency that you've seen? I think I know the answer, but I'll ask you as the expert.
Well, I mean, dude, it's about the evolution of access controls and where the current state of the nation seems to be, what I see in Snowflake and others, is role based access control, right? So you have a role, you can be assigned one or many roles. And so your user will inherit the privileges of your role. So if you're a data engineer and you're able to see this type of data because you need to work with it to build a data pipeline, and maybe you're also a data analyst. So you switch role or you actually have the privileges associated with an analyst. So that role based access control is sort of base table stakes. You also need to think about discretionary access control. So data objects, tables, fields, right? So you also need to think about column. So, if your data is in a table, if it's structured like that, then there might be certain columns like employee pay that has a different column-based policy, and there might be row access policies. So, in the database world, and I'm sure I missed half a dozen other aspects of this, but when we think about structured data management, those access privileges and how to think about them, each database vendor has their own sort of perspective on it. And it's not standard, but once you've seen enough databases like I have, you kind of figure out the universe of all of the things you could do. And the way to think about it is, how do I take that knowledge and structure that around how I think about agents or any application accessing data? So, yeah, it's there's no standard. Uh,
Well, I think you've reminded me several times. I'll put words in your mouth, but I'm pretty sure you've said this probably 18 times to me today. But data is the fuel for agents. So the complexity that we see in just the role-based access control, for example, in the variance in the database community, means that the complexity that the agents are going to inherit is obviously manifest and real, is it not?
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me of the fundamental question somebody would always ask, and I would, because I deal with every level of the organization because I've done it before, the chief data officer or the analytics officer or just the DBA, or not just the DBA or the platform engineer, that say, dude, what's the best practice? And the answer is always the same, and it's just hard to do. The answer should be, where you store the data, you should have access control at the finest grain level where practical. Now, that has never always been practical. And so, but in cloud, well organized, well structured cloud databases, it's at that fine grain. And Snowflake's a great example of that. This is not a plug for them. Uh, but the challenge most people have is every application they own has its own security model. So if you go into Salesforce, hopefully they use the same ID to log in and they do a single sign on. Great. But you have privileges in Salesforce for access to certain modules and components and data objects. And that's a completely different security model than maybe Workday. Certainly different than the BI tool. And here's the classic example, even in a Microsoft world where they're trying to solve it all, and they've got a lot of great strategies. Um, Power BI, when you connect that to Snowflake, the question is, well, where do I manage users and how do I think about permissions? Well, the correct answer, if you're following the leading practice, is to do it at the database level. Well, a lot of people build applications and a lot of thinking around how they control access to data at the tool layer. And so they're largely inconsistent. And the biggest hole in town, and everybody knows this, we don't talk about it a lot, is this notion of a service account, which is a top secret way of saying we're going to open up access between these two applications. And we're going to ask you, the engineers who build these integration points, to do the right thing when you're opening up these service accounts. And that presents a very serious and real security exposure, because a service account is what a lot of people do is they try to use that as the simplifier so that you don't have every account in Power BI have a ID in Snowflake. And so where you make those choices, there's no one answer, but that's the kind of things we always talk about when we're talking about platform level security. So,
Got it. I just want to talk briefly about the service accounts that you mentioned. I know these things well. Back in the day when I was an executive at banks and insurance companies, I had to attest
yeah,
to the fact that these service accounts, which represented applications, had a correct or at least a valid set of permissions and capabilities. Now, as an executive, I had 70 applications that I needed to think about. When we talk about thousands of agents or tens of thousands of agents, that becomes unmanageable. That's not practical. It's not even feasible. So I think
right.
there's a few things I'd welcome your thought on this, but I think we need a different model for how we're going to manage identity and role and access control for agents.
Yeah. Listen, it's going to be hard or it's going to be complicated. And complicated things are okay because we can understand them. As long as we know that they're complicated, we will allow ourselves enough time to understand it until it becomes simple. Now, getting back to agents, I think, and I might be going in a direction different than what you might think, but I think one of the complications with agents, and we need to come back to it because it's not a well solved problem, is we've got RBAC for structured data. What do we have for unstructured data? Right. And how do we have that same fidelity of control when an agent says, well, I'm the compliance analyst, I should be able to see all this. Well, how do you translate that privilege to the unstructured data or the knowledge or the concepts that or policies related to that data? And so I think that's as I talk to a number of people, that's an unsolved or not an unsolved problem, that there's no common thread around how to do that effectively. And I think that just reminds us that there's a lot more to work out here because we haven't built agents at scale before in the enterprise.
I think you're highlighting a key point in that some domains have been solved.
Yeah.
Relational databases, not simple to do, but it's a known problem.
Yeah.
There's solutions for it. Unstructured data, not as known a problem domain, not as solved. People will figure it out. But I think, I'm going to come back to the anchor point for agents.
Yeah.
And we've said the word so many times, but it starts with identity. And it
Yeah.
ends, if we do, and there's a layer cake model that we can talk about, but starts with identity, but ultimately it ends with trust.
Yeah.
KYA means we trust the agent to do what it says it's going to do. We trust the
Bingo.
agent and we trust the ecosystem that it runs in. And we know there's going to be thousands of agents. We trust not only the agent and the ecosystem, but we trust that we can manage it at scale. It's a federated model, delegated responsibilities. These are the things that I welcome your thoughts on, but trust is the anchor point for all this, is it not?
Yeah, listen, and we did talk about this back in episode 5. And I think we've come a long way introducing other concepts as well. So I want to tie it together a little bit more precisely, maybe than we did before. Um, and that's the verification process. And we all have heard the term trust but verify. I mean, I think that is the minimum viable approach to trusting agents in the enterprise is we need to know what they're supposed to be doing, their intent, as you always say, and we need proof. We need evidence. We need to verify that what we've asked them to do, they're doing. And to your point, I'll steal your line. We need to make sure that that is federated so that we just have to acknowledge the reality, right? Like the sales, you just take the application example. No, there's not a common privilege model across applications. There's not across agents. We just need to be open that these are things that we need to treat as first class challenges or things to look at.
Yeah. Now, I just want to kind of, first off, I'm going to go in a slight tangent here.
Yeah.
The common frameworks that are taking hold, A to A and MCP, do have a
Yeah.
perspective
Yeah.
on this. They do have a perspective. Now, here's what they say. If I were to trivialize it, extensively, what they're saying is identity is important, and oh, by the way, we're going to leave it to you, the implementer, to figure
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
how are you going to do that, and we may throw you some OAuth 2 hints along the way. That's the state of the nation today.
Yeah.
I wanted to have just a quick discussion around where we think it needs to go, and perhaps are there some vehicles that can get us there. So I'm going to talk about agent cards. This is the
Yeah.
description of an agent, and the agent card or the agent.md seems to be the way to go. Our proposition is that maybe we ought to be thinking about how to codify the identity and perhaps even the roles in there. I think when we think about agent skills, skills are a pretty big deal these days, especially with the coding agent, but they're transferring directly into the enterprise agent space. There's a way, so the agent card will say what an agent can do. The skill will say how it can do it. So there are some vehicles, John, where we can actually think about how we apply some of these concepts, but this is early stage.
Yeah. 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 And let me play the data guy from way back. So at the DAMA LA conference last week, we were talking about data in the entertainment industry. And there's something that had to be created back in the days of HBO. I met the woman who did the design, and she said, listen, when HBO creates a title for a product, what are the language codes for what versions of Spanish are we translating it into? And they had a few different. And so she was the woman, the taxonomist, the brilliant metadata master who's known in the industry. And there's a whole crew of them that I got to meet that created something called IDERS, or essentially it's the identifier, the reference data that is managed centrally to define the unique IDs for titles. Now, they haven't solved all the problems in the entertainment industry. They don't have a party ID or an artist and la, 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 la. But when I think about agents and when I think about skills.md and agent.md and anything with an MD in it, it sounds like somebody, an engineer, had came up with it. And what I love about engineers is we solve problems. I'm an engineer, and I love being an engineer. We simplified the mathematics of, complex equations by translating things into the Fourier domain, and that makes engineering easy. But engineers simplify; they're not pure math guys. And so the pure math guy would say, listen, you're missing a bunch of harmonic frequencies, or I don't know what they would say, but I know what a data person or a taxonomist or a knowledge management person would say is that, listen, you guys can come up with all kinds of keywords, but every time you come up with a new keyword, nobody's sort of organizing that as first class reference data. So, and whether you call it reference data or metadata, what is the obvious concern is that all these MD files are coming up with their own sort of arbitrary standards about how we're creating yet another YAML file standard, yet another markup language. And we're treating it as if this is the first time we've defined a document. And it's just not true. So, whilst I am a big proponent, I use all these coding tools and I love my coding agents. Dude, this is not scalable, and we have not figured out how to do this at scale there, and it'll be as equal an problem in the enterprise space, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember I was having a discussion with some engineers earlier today. We were talking,
Yeah.
just to give you an example, on skills. And
Uh,
there's thousands of them everywhere. And
yeah.
one can debate the efficacy of some of them, but there's some that are they're pretty rich and used frequently. But here's the thing that these engineers mentioned to me. They said, "Look, Eric, there's no standard. They all look different. So, if we want to build a system that actually manages these, and I'm in an enterprise and I need some level of coherence and consistency, where do I start?" Here's the challenge, John, to your point. I think we're still
Yeah.
on that journey, but today,
Yeah.
uh, the only thing I can advise is there's lessons learned from the past, whether it's database world, or the business process worlds, or literally HR for employee management, applying that. There's lessons learned.
Yes.
We can stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and not make the same mistakes that folks did. That doesn't change the fact that simple things like a skill.md, it's going to take a while before that becomes consistent enough for use widely in enterprises in a safe and reliable way.
Well, no, good. I'm so glad you said that because when we were talking about skills the other day, I was like, dude, you understand that this is as much a dog's breakfast as the rest of this stuff in MD files. Um, and there are a lot of existing standards for how to do things like we talked about. So I remember I was back in the early aughts. I met a guy from, I think it was Lawrence Livermore, one of the super sensitive research labs. And he was saying, dude, we had an XML standard that allowed us to define permissions based on the section of the document. And because it was XML, we had all the structure. And then you kids with your JSON threw it all out. And so, dude, it's known to me that there are already answers to all the questions we're asking. We need to get more people involved in the conversation to help us understand how to solve these things at scale. And I agree with you on that point.
So I think maybe, there's a few things that came out loud and clear to me in this
Yeah.
discussion is there are models, KYC, KYB, that we can apply to agents, but they're limited. Maybe a better model is the KYE for the employee. And maybe there's a whole bunch of HR practices that we ought to be looking at. There's a whole lot of lessons in the database community, in the unstructured data management community, maybe through things like organizations like DAMA, that we should be learning from, and not being scared to apply older techniques to some of the newer tech.
Yeah. Well, let's shout out to the knowledge management folks out there and the digital asset management folks. I did want to, because they're going to be part of this, and one other thought, and I know this is going to be a jump back to a previous conversation, but it's about this notion of an ID, right? You want the agent to have an ID that doesn't get reused, right? You can't do that. Otherwise, how do we how do we know? So, agents, we haven't even touched the complexity of the agent itself. An agent is made up of prompts, right? And it does it and the configuration of the agent itself can change. So attesting to agent 67 is doing this. Well, what version of Agent 67 are you working with? Because somebody updated the underlying model. Did you know that? The behavior changes because we all know that that comes free with every model. Behavior change. Maybe somebody swapped it out for a cheaper model. Did you retest it? Did you reattest? And so there's what the thing that I just want to say out loud, because I said it back on our first RAG project, retrieval augmented generation, is when the software developers were treating prompts as arbitrary, I was like, I want to die. You guys don't understand that the prompt is the programming language that you're interfacing with the LLM. If you are not versioning your prompts and treating those as first class objects, you're literally making this, we're doing it the wrong way. Now, that was 2023. We've come a long way. People have done a lot of thinking around prompts and how to manage them at scale. But I think all of the artifacts or all the little files that make up an agent and what we call the agent ecosystem in your book, I think that is there's a lot to be sorted through there. Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of complexity. So just the files, the things that
Right.
we've mentioned in this call, agent MD, skill.md,
Yeah.
YAML files, we have JSON files, we have stuff for tools.
Yeah.
As you said, there's a dog's breakfast. There's a whole raft of things you need to think about, and you need to version them all.
Yeah.
And there's probably more things that I've missed. You need to not only version the all those artifacts that I mentioned, but you have to version and understand the model, as you highlighted. The model, you change the model, the behavior of the agent changes. What it says to me is we're just scraping the surface of what we need to do to manage agents. This is a change
Right.
management problem as much as it is an operational problem. And the sooner we realize that that's the case, the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, and let's end on, and I think we're at the end. If you agree, I just want to say something really positive. There are a lot of engineers out there building great agentic systems, and I love the work I'm seeing at a number of them. And I will quote them and repeat what they say because they're very smart and doing good work. So we are making progress. And the purpose of this podcast is not to necessarily complain about everything, but rather to uh, provide an opportunity to say what is still evolving and how to think about it today. And as it evolves in the future, we'll come back to this. And hopefully, it'll be a lot simpler.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a very good point. First off, anybody who's doing work in agents today, he needs an attaboy, get some kudos.
Yeah.
The reason being is there's a lot of variables, there are a lot of balls in the air, and you're juggling a ton of things. And if you can make your agent work, congratulations. If you figured out how to, even though they may be a little inconsistent, the folks at Anthropic that came up with the skills.md and the folks that are now evolving it, these guys are fantastic. The capabilities are evolving so rapidly. I would say they're not bad today. They may be a little bit immature, but they're evolving so rapidly that very, very quickly we're going to see something that does become enterprise grade. I'm absolutely convinced of that based on how I see things evolving in the industry.
Okay, can I put you on the spot? When are we going to have enterprise grade agents, Eric? Is it going to be the end of 26 or is it going to be longer? And we're not talking about AGI either. We're just talking about enterprise grade agents.
Well, I think so. So it's actually a very good question, and it depends a little bit on your perspective. But here's what I would call an enterprise grade agent. It is something that you can push into production, and as we said earlier, the agent needs to have an identity. The agent needs to have role-based access control, et cetera. It needs to have observability and all those capabilities. That's the stuff that is absolute minimum table stakes, but it's necessary, but not sufficient. You need to have an enterprise grade agent ecosystem that lets you manage, they can communicate and collaborate in a consistent way, discovery. But here's my prediction is I think it's going to happen much, much sooner than we think. I think the trajectory that I'm seeing is I would not be surprised that within less than 6 months, we're going to start to see some really significant progress addressing things around what we talked about today, and quite frankly, in the broader trust framework that you need to think through. I'm optimistic. I'm not going to say it's easy, and I'm not going to say in 6 months we'll have a standard, but I think we're going to see some incredible progress.
Awesome. To be continued. Talk to you next week.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.